Past Investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. The Past Investigated.
Hopefully that'll work. We're having, again, fun issues here. But the first thing is welcome to the Sunday, May 4th, 2025. May the 4th be with you, because history is now also Star Wars. The topic today is actually incredibly large. So what we decided to do is we kind of trimmed down the 3-hour presentation that we had into about an hour. And this is going to be a primer. The reason because the story of who we're looking at today, which is the Rockefeller Network, is so vast. It is almost like describing the United States and the United Nations from 100 years all in an hour and everything that they've had impact on. So what we decided to do was kind of give a overview of who was Rockefeller, how did he set up that organizational structure that was the Rockefeller Foundation, and then go into, okay, well, what does that mean? What is that oligarchy interfacing with you in your life in the US government, other governments, with different social organizations? In other words, what does it mean for you watching this today? How should you know about Rockefeller? What should you know about Rockefeller? And how is it impacting you currently? Now, the reason, again, that we're kind of starting on Rockefeller is, and why are we even studying oligarchies? And there was a great quote attributed to Themistocles. And he said that Athens controls Greece. I control Athens. My wife controls me. And our infant son controls my wife. And what Themistocles was saying was something that every investigator understands inherently. There's always a group, an influence, a person or a group, or even an ideal behind the person, behind the king, behind the emperor. Even if you are an absolutist dictator, there is some influence behind you that you feel you are beholden to, either in reality or in your mind. You are beholden to that person. So what Themistocles was saying, that if you look at what was going on in Greece, some people just saw the leaders of Greece. Others would say, okay, well, Athens runs Greece. Others say, well, guess who runs Athens? That's Themistocles. But if you peel back that onion, you're going to see, well, guess what? It's the infant son that's really kind of driving some of those decisions. And so when you look around today and you say there's things that just don't make sense, especially after 2020, a lot of people were having a huge paradigm shift, but a lot of people were getting stuck. It was that epistemological moment where the world didn't make sense. And you go, I don't understand this. And things seem to operate contrary. When you add in the factor of studying the oligarchs and oligarch power structures and how they interact both with governmental, non-governmental, and societal mechanisms and organizations, then you begin to say, okay, now things begin to become clear, and now we kind of have a predictive model. So we're going to go a little bit into this today. And if there are any questions, please put them in the comments. We'll definitely have a question and answer at the end of the comments. We might do a part 2 of this to dive into each of the sections that we're going to go on today. But like I said, the more you kind of peel the onion back on the Rockefeller Network, the much more difficult it is to be able to explain, because there's so much detail there. But we do have a couple of case studies. We get kind of a good overview of it so that you can identify it and say, okay, I think the pattern here is, this is what it is, especially when you're studying history and things that just don't make sense from a national level. Look at it from an oligarch power level, and then it begins to make sense, or how the interaction or the negotiation between the oligarchy and the government, its system, plays out. So again, this is part 2. We're going to review a little bit of part 1 in there, just to kind of catch you up. If you haven't seen it, go back and look at part 1. It's about basically how Panama came about, but understanding that oligarch structure. That's a very good case study in how did a lawyer create a nation. And if you're wondering how, we'll get to that here in a second in the review. But who we are, essentially, we're a small collection of historians, private investigators, government investigators, intelligence analysis, that like to get together and look at history from an evidence-based approach, a fresh way. Myself, I'm Al Johnson. I was former U.S. military EOD. We worked counter IED. And for about 12 years, I was working on various projects, both in the military and out of the military, in tracking networks. So we would look at, okay, it's great. I can disarm a bomb, or you could do post blast forensics in a bomb, kind of the physical forensics. But what was really interesting is if you keep peeling back that onion, okay, well, who funded the guy that made the bomb? Who trained the guy that made the bomb? And the most interesting part, of course, was, well, who how did he radicalize in the first place? What were those inputs that he was getting that made him want to even build a bomb and go kill people in the first place? That was fascinating. And so through that, you had to actually use history to a large degree, because that is how that individual saw himself in the world around him and which groups that he felt affiliated to and angry against. So history plays a tremendous role in shaping our current and future events. And that's why history is important. And for us, it's just fun. So we're a bunch of history nerds at heart, and probably use this as an excuse to be able to justify why we have to look at history so much when we're doing our analysis. And that's who we are, and that's who I am. We're going to again look into the Rockefeller Network. This is barely even the onion. I mean, this looks like a crowded little slide, but it's not even part of it. As most people would know, John David Rockefeller Sr. Was the Standard Oil. He was the first American billionaire. He had created a giant empire, initially of oil, but also with transportation, with steel. And he later transformed that economic empire into basically a social shaping cultural government empire that affects everyone, whether you realize it or not. And it has impacted well beyond his lifespan. They are now into the 7th generation of Rockefellers, and there are about 260 named Rockefeller relatives, probably more, as you look into it. So you'll see the name Rockefeller, and it may not be John David Sr. It may be one of the many very, very, very prodigious descendants that he had. Some became United States vice presidents. Many of them were very influential in the United Nations, and they have definitely shaped America and the globe in a cohesive, consistent way, which is important versus kind of a flash in the pan because, the guy was a multi-billionaire and wanted to, influence things around him. It was, as you'll see, it was a very cohesive network that lasted far beyond the lifespan of himself, his children, and even his grandchildren. It impacts us today in a very large way. So again, we're going to go over everything on this one. It's going to be pretty quick. What we're doing right now is the intro. We're going to review a little bit about the first episode here with Panama. Then we're going to go into the methods evaluation so you understand why we chose the oligarchs that we did and how we evaluate, are they truly oligarchs that still impact today versus, okay, it was a flash in the pan and it's purely for historical research. We're going to review, again, the organizational structure that they built. And then we're actually going to, it should say part 3, and that's overseas operations. So we're looking at how it operated in America. Now, in the next 2 weeks from now, we're going to look more into oligarch structures, including Rockefeller, including Cromwell and Sullivan that we learned about last week, that begin to literally create entire organizations overseas that moves the course. So when you see the history of another country, sometimes it is intertwined with the history of your own country's oligarchy. So just keep that in mind. It's absolutely fascinating. It's going to take another 2 weeks to put all of it together. We've been working on that for about 6 months. And that's what I said in the beginning. Themistocles said it best. Always peel the onion back to see who's really influencing. And sometimes it can even be, from my personal experience as a side note, it can be the imagination or the memory of someone who's not even there, physically there anymore. So, for example, a mob boss that is somehow trying to continue on to impress his dead father because he's still trying to live up to his dead father or his missing father. That is his reference point, and his imagination or his memory or the imaginatory memory of what his father's values were, or how his father would see him, is shaping his decisions, even if they're detrimental to himself and the organization that he's running. So we have to understand it's called referential power, that there's a reference in his mind that has power over him. So sometimes we can't physically see it. We can only know it from the words that they do, or if you kind of get to a psychological, evaluation of him, or able to go in there and elicit a lot of information from him, do you begin to see, okay, well, wait a minute, maybe he's measuring his success off of someone that's not even with us anymore. And that's possible. So there's always going to be a power behind the throne. Even John David Rockefeller, the most powerful man in the world, the first billionaire, the richest man in the world at the time, and arguably adjusted for inflation and other factors, he would be still the richest man today if he was alive and if his wealth transferred over. Even he had people that he was beholden to. So always understand that. And then the oligarchs themselves will control governments. And that's what the next one is. I would highly recommend a good book, Machiavellian's Defenders of Freedom. It's an excellent, excellent book by James Burnham. And it opens up basically understanding that what Machiavelli was talking about was essentially oligarchical structures, right? A government in itself, even of a dictatorial power, as we mentioned, can't function without the support base. And sometimes a well-organized minority, a well-organized small organization can provide that support base. And it's a lot easier just to work with that one guy that can give you your support versus I have to keep 100,000 people in my district happy all the time. And politicians will tell you that all the time. That's why special interests have so much power, is because it's easier for a politician to work with one guy. I just got to convince him to stay on board and he'll do the rest. He'll mobilize everything. He'll give me my campaign funds. He'll, get those votes together, bundle them for, the politician, and good to go. Versus I have to go out to every single, state farm or whatever, shake hands with everybody, kiss every baby, take every photo thing, and keep everybody happy with town hall meetings every single week. Right. So a politician, by their very nature, by human nature, will go for the easiest route. That which is easy to do gets done first and gets done the most often. That's a maxim. So again, Machiavellian's Defenders of Freedom, a very good book with looking at oligarchical structures, and it helps you to be able to see the true power dynamics within even a constitutional republic. They have these factors that do take effect upon it. And there he is right there. It's a great quote. In reality, the dominion of an organized minority obeying a single impulse over the unorganized majority is inevitable. And that is exactly what Rockefeller built up and why he was able to influence so much of the federal government of the United States and other nations against the will, many times, of the people themselves. Now, going into our methodology and evaluation, we are evidence-based approach, which is basically we follow the facts wherever they go. Sometimes it's emotionally uncomfortable, but that's what you have to do, right? In other words, we've had folks in the organization here that are Catholic. Hey, if the Catholic Church did something or a beloved priest did something, okay, well that's the facts. We're not going to hide it. We're not going to try to whitewash it. There it is. There's the facts. Here you go. Is it emotionally uncomfortable? Yes, but is it necessary to talk about this and to say these are the facts and this is the evidence and this is the conclusion based on the facts? Yes. So it differs from an academic-based approach or an emotional-based approach. Again, rational versus emotional. We look also at organizational structure dictates outcome. Unfortunately, in a lot of the academic evaluations of history in America, they look for the big man approach, right? It's all Napoleon, it's all George Washington, it's all this guy. And that's great for stories, right? When you're hanging around a campfire, you want to listen to the great story about a great man and it inspires you. And this is how if I can just behave like, Abraham Lincoln, I can do great things. But understand that the organizational structure that Abraham Lincoln was functioning in is as responsible for his success and failures as he was himself, right? We cannot affect things as a human being, as an individual human being. We have very limited ability to affect things if the organizational structure is against us or in opposition to what we're trying to do. And even a cursory study of actual power politics will show you that. Link analysis, we look at social, legal, financial, and associative through time, not just in one period of time. We got a number of emails and messages about, look at this group, look at that group. And when you do, okay, well, during a certain period like the Napoleonic Wars up until the early, mid to 1850s, 1860s, that group was powerful, but then they deteriorated and went away. And in a small area, they had a little bit of influence and their name was still there, but they didn't have the means to be able to do it. So through time is what we look at. You need a generation or two or three to be considered a oligarchy of note. Pattern analysis, in other words, if they're consistent in what they do, that's great. One or two anomalies doesn't really make an oligarchy of power. If they're only, in fact, one bill through the Senate and then they don't do anything for another 50 years, they're really not that much of note. And finally, we look at the MMO, which is means, motive, and opportunity. And again, organizational structure, both the person, the family, what's going on in his mind, as well as the whole national system. Labels do matter. So if we say it's an oligarchy, it's an oligarchy. We don't use the word elite or titans. We say oligarchy because it best describes what they are. If it's not a democracy, we don't say it's a democracy. It's a constitutional republic, that sort of thing. And again, if you build something, sometimes that organization itself may take a different tact. Now, we saw that a little bit with Cromwell and Sullivan last week, but this week with Rockefeller, we're going to see how he kind of ensured that organization would maintain its cohesiveness in purpose over time to match his purpose before he passed away. And again, this is means, motive, opportunity. Means, do they have the resources? It could be money and power or money or power. Money doesn't equate to power. Power doesn't always equate to money. Motive, do they benefit? Is it a pattern or is it even a quid pro quo? I may not benefit myself directly, but the neighbor who I owe a favor to, okay, he's going to benefit, so I'm going to do this for him. So you have to look at those extended networks and see, okay, who's benefiting from what? and then the opportunity. Are they in the right place, the right time, and then the pattern over time to be able to shape those events? All right. So, quick review last week. The man in the middle right there is William Nelson Cromwell. And as we said last week, there's a lawyer that had so much power that he was able to take on behalf of a French client, the French Panama Canal Company was able to mobilize the United States military under Secretary of State John Hay and the Secretary of the Navy and President Theodore Roosevelt to send warships down to blockade a nation we had a treaty with to defend, to prevent them from squashing a secessionist rebellion led by the members of the lawyers' company, the railroad company in Panama. The President Amato that you see there in the bottom, he was the surgeon at the railroad company that was presided over by William Nelson Cromwell, the lawyer, and was given Revolution in a Box by Cromwell. That's the flag there, the original flag up there. But even Amato and his group said, yeah, that's too close to the Americans. Nobody will ever believe it. So they created another flag, the actual Panamanian flag used today. And then they created the country of Panama. And then the French client suddenly became the ambassador to U.S. from Panama, even though he's not a Panamanian citizen and barely spent any time down there. And so, and once he signed the Treaty of the Panama Canal, then he quits and someone else comes in to be ambassador, which for a time was actually William Nelson Cromwell, the lawyer. Now, how could he do this? How could a lawyer get the United States Secretary of State Hay to go along with sending U.S. troops down to a nation that we had a treaty with to defend against these sorts of things? And hey, it's a bunch of railroad guys that are going to create a revolution, create a brand new country, and we're going to sign this treaty. Why did they go along with that? Why did Theodore Roosevelt go along with that? Well, part of the answer is the clients that Cromwell had. And above him, you'll see J.P. Morgan. Everybody knows J.P. Morgan Chase and John David Rockefeller Sr. Those were his clients. He created U.S. Steel. He did GE, reorganized a number of businesses for those titans, for those oligarchs. And so he was able to utilize their associative power to be able to get his things done. Now, there's also some information that J.P. Morgan himself financially profited from the Panama Canal. So that plays into it. In other words, the payments had to go through J.P. Morgan's bank. So there's a lot of quid pro quo in this one, but that's the power he had. So today we're going to look at one of his clients that became a oligarch in his own right, and probably the king of all oligarchs. This is the oligarch's oligarch, and that's John David Rockefeller. John David Rockefeller has a fascinating story. And remember, I talked earlier about sometimes it's the association of who's in your mind, of a dead father or a father that's absent, that person is kind of trying to please in their mind. It's an associative relationship. It's not real. It's not physical anymore. Well, John David Rockefeller, his father was literally a snake oil salesman. It's not hyperbole. He was a snake oil salesman, and they were in New York, and he sold snake oil. And then he, of course, married Johnny Rockefeller's mother. They were having kids, and then he allegedly raped a underage girl, like was 16 years old. To avoid the trial, he skipped town. They moved out to the Midwest, and then he left the family. So he left the family, entered in another relationship out of state, married. But he didn't divorce John D. Rockefeller's mother. He married, and again, so he's a bigamist. And then that wasn't enough, so he ended up shacking up with another mistress in that state. So essentially he had a common law wife, 2 legal married wives, and a number of children throughout all 3 relationships. Meanwhile, back in John D. Rockefeller's family, so the father is mostly absent, and then he's almost always absent. The mother is a very fundamentalist Baptist, and possibly some of this was due to the strain that she was under, right? So they were financially very poor, even though sometimes John D. Rockefeller's father would come home with, tremendous, wealth. The family wasn't feeling it, right? So they just never passed down to the family. So the mother's under a lot of strain. And allegedly, there are reports that the mother would tie John D. Rockefeller to a fence post and beat him and leave him out overnight if he did not comply exactly with what she wanted. Now, that would definitely have a psychological impact upon a young John D. Rockefeller, in other words, and it's associated to some degree with his father, who has these salesmanship-like skills. So how much of that impacted him, we're not 100% sure. You can't really, if you never met the guy and you don't do it. But based on other cases, that definitely had an impact, and that may have clouded his relationship with other people, especially in business. So in short order, John D. Rockefeller, to kind of cut this into a very Cliff's Notes version, he begins a ruthless business practice that eventually gobbles up 95% of U.S. oil, of all of the oil in the U.S., and that's from the mining to the refining to the transportation to the sales. He starts out with kerosene. He gets a good inside scoop with technology when everybody was using whale oil. This is before the oil boom. Everybody's using whale oil to light the lamps. Well, there's a technical guy next to him. He says, "Hey, guess what? I can treat that whale oil and petroleum oil with another chemical that will then lead to kerosene. It burns better. It's cheaper. You can mass manufacture it. It's great." And John D says, "Hey, that's great." Instilling upon him that there's innovations out there, right? You can kind of begin to use these innovations to make a product that's better. And through that innovation, he gets an advantage. And then he uses that advantage ruthlessly. He then uses inside deals. So he begins to merge in with the transportation network. So you look at the Pennsylvania Railroad and others that were transporting the oil, and he gets inside deals, not just inside deals that he gets a discount. The railroads end up paying him for carrying other competing oil companies' cargo, and he gets the intelligence on them. So he's looking at kind of a full battle. I mean, it's almost like a military battle with the other competitors. And then when they're hurting, they're bankrupt, he's swallowing them up. In fact, he seems to thrive in bad times. The chaos and the downturns in the market, he actually gains, right? Because he saves up and he has a war chest, and he's able to go just gobble up the competition. So it was kind of like the Microsoft of oil back in the day. And that was John D. Rockefeller. So very quickly, he gets about 95% of the oil. He ends up with U.S. Steel. He's got just tremendous amounts of assets, and he begins to have a prodigious family. Those are the grandchildren there. In the picture to the right, there's John D. Rockefeller Jr. And then his family. And among those grandkids right there of John D. Rockefeller Sr., you have U.S. vice presidents. You have members that were very influential in the United Nations. I mean, shaping America and the world to the present day. And I said they're in effectively the seventh generation was born now, about 260 relatives, many of which became politicians, many of which use what we'll learn about here, the organization he set up to be able to impact the world outside of political means, but by using political means. So it's that associative. And again, he's a very powerful man, but he did have a haunted past. There was kind of a ghost, right? Kind of a Shakespearean, regret that he had. That something was driving him. And you can see two periods in his life. The beginning of his life, kind of represented by the photograph on the left, the beginning of his life was just ruthless. He's kind of like his father. I'll sell anything to anybody. Snake oil salesman, but it's a product that people need, and he grabs up all of the competition. Just absolutely dominates 95% of oil. Imagine if Larry Ellison, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Zuckerberg, Elon, all of that was wrapped into one guy with that amount of power. 95% of the internet and communication devices and computers was owned by one guy. That's effectiveness. He was between, depending on the year you look at, 1.2 to about 1.8% he had that money, the gross domestic product of the United States. He was 1.8% of the gross domestic product of the United States in his personal wealth. Right now, Elon Musk is about 0.8, depending on when you look at it, 0.08. And I think the next one was Jeff Bezos, and he's about 0.06. So the ratio of power to the federal power for this guy was tremendous, and he used it. He didn't just sit back in his laurels. He definitely used it. Now, why did he start to change later on in life? A lot of it comes down to this guy. Always look for a guy behind the scenes, right? The sigma behind the scenes that latches onto an alpha. This is Frederick T. Gates, and definitely a name you should know and look more about. He's 1853 to 1929. He was one of the four guys that managed a lot of the Rockefeller assets and portfolios. He was the genius behind the acquisition of a large mining operation within the United States that kind of gave U.S. Steel a boost. And so he was very good with money, but he was a Baptist preacher, and his father was a Baptist preacher. So that he had in common with Rockefeller. They had very fundamentalist Baptist views, turn of the century into the 19th century, early 20th century Baptist views, which are somewhat different than they are today. There was kind of a Christian socialism that we mentioned on a book talk that's upcoming that most Americans don't really understand. And that was infused a little bit within their ideology. But he managed Rockefeller money. Rockefeller trusted him. And he had also worked with Pillsbury, George Pillsbury, who was the Pillsbury, the Doughboy, the Pillsbury Bakery, the Pillsbury Rolls, that guy. And so this guy, Frederick Gates, had set up a philanthropic organization for the Pillsbury millions. And he encouraged Rockefeller Sr. to do the same. So he recognized within his business partner at the time, or the guy he was working for in business, that there was this need of Rockefeller to do something with life as he's entering in the final phases of his life. What am I going to do with all these? I've earned everything. I'm king of the world. What do I do? And Gates begins to play a couple of roles. It may have been like the father that Rockefeller didn't have. There may have been some relationship in there due to his estranged father. It may also be that there was a lot of commonality within their upbringing, their religious outlook, their worldview. But whatever the case, Rockefeller trusted Gates and said, okay, let's set up a couple of things. The first thing they set up was in 1890. They began, along with the Baptist Educational Group, to set up the University of Chicago. So Rockefeller money, along with the structure that Gates provided and his association with the Baptist Education Group, set up the University of Chicago. And the University of Chicago was set up. The charter of the founding of the University of Chicago was to train minds in a different way. And that's what they were doing. And it was kind of a new morality base. They looked at the body, the mind, and the soul. They wanted kind of a new man along different lines. They said that the world or American culture, world culture as it existed at their time, was a cause of many problems. And so they wanted to address that. And they had to do it through indoctrination and through cultural restructuring. So they knew early on they were going to do it. And then later, he began to shape, starting about 1909, he started shaping the Rockefeller Foundation. He said, this is what you got to do. And Rockefeller knew this. He said, if you look at Carnegie, you look at others, the millionaires that were there, the first generation after they pass, or at most the second, definitely by the third, that money's gone. And usually the children are debased. They've used the money for, their own purposes, and it's gone. And the children are an embarrassment to the scion that's, has departed. Rockefeller didn't want that. Frederick Gates said, hey, no problem. Let's set up a foundation. And this foundation is what we are effectively talking about when we talk about the Rockefeller Network. But it's not the only part. It's just the core of this gigantic network. So what they ended up doing, you have to understand, in about 1909 to 1911. So when they started setting up the foundation, before that, Rockefeller was paying directly. So Standard Oil was all his. 95% roughly of all oil was owned by Rockefeller, him personally. And so what he did was he would take that money and he started up the University of Chicago with his personal money. He would set up other organizations such as the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, right? It's now the Rockefeller University. And that was in 1901. So he was already setting up these charitable organizations before he had set up his foundation. So he already had this kind of largesse. He wanted to shape minds. He wanted to shape outcomes on a national scale, on a cultural scale, and eventually an international scale. So that was already fixed in there. But to do that, he had to create a foundation. Why? Well, one of the reasons was the United States began antitrust laws. And these antitrust laws effectively split up about 1911. They split up the Rockefeller empire. So instead of one organization, it was a multi-headed hydra. But Rockefeller was managed to, in part because of Cromwell and his legal ability, he knew how to set up front companies. They set this up. So now it was actually more difficult if you wanted to bring down the Rockefeller empire. It's more difficult. Why? It's a multi-headed hydra, but he still gets the revenue. He still owns these. And if you'll notice over time, a lot of them merge in there. So yes, there's no Rockefeller Standard Oil that most people recognize, but you would recognize Chevron. You do recognize ExxonMobil, Marathon, and BP. And those are all descendants of, so to speak, of that. There's over 200, I think it was 313 companies that we have tracked so far that are part of the Rockefeller world. He either owns a majority stake in them or a significant amount of shares that he has a vote, or the Rockefeller Foundation or the Rockefeller Brother Fund has a vote. So there's a tremendous network of businesses and investment groups outside of the oil network. That's just one. That's why this thing has so many legs and tentacles. It's just impossible in 1 hour to go through this. But that gives you an idea about how they were able to do it. And so what they did, if you go back to this one, what they did was they're saying, okay, we're going to tie in now that business, all those businesses, but we're going to put all that money outside of you. It's not going to be your money. It's going to set up a trust, kind of like a foundation. And that foundation was 1909. They started on it. It was formalized in the state of, I believe, New Jersey in 1913. And that was the Rockefeller Foundation. And it basically took all of this money, this tremendous profit, and put it into philanthropic social shaping, was essentially what it is. So more money than almost all the nations in the world had at the time is now going to be applied to social change and medical change. And he created other associations. So it's not just the Rockefeller Association that you have to look at, right? So that's just one. That's like the clearinghouse. Some of the associations, like I said, in 1901, he made the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. It's now known as Rockefeller University, but it was designed to look at diseases and how culture affects diseases and what you can change both medically and culturally to control that disease. And it was a tremendous control model. We'll get into that here in a minute. Everything he did wasn't just for philanthropy. The genius of kind of the Rockefeller Foundation and all of these associations that are associated with, either directly controlled by or massively funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, have a core principle. There's a charter. He gives money, very specific causes with specific specified outcomes. In other words, he says the vision has to be first. What's the goal? And then I'll give the money, right? And there has to be a couple things. It's not just for, good feelings. He never gave away the money. It was always that there'll be a second or third order effect that we're going to get a profit from it. So for example, Rockefeller was all about population reduction, massive about population reduction. For 100 years, he's tried to reduce the world population because he says it's going to destroy us. That's what his thought was. Actually, it was a lot about eugenics. We'll get into that here in a second. But part of that was then he begins to invest in companies that develop birth control, right? And he begins to develop institutions and associations to study sexuality. They do speaking tours. So he's buying influence. He's getting profit from that. So there's always kind of what they call impact investing. So there's going to be a definitely a return on their investment, both in financial terms and in social control and shaping that they want it to. So it maintains that Rockefeller Sr.'s purpose and drive in this, because and this is interesting, all of the Rockefeller descendants in the Rockefeller Foundation. So the kids don't get anything except through the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, they each have, it's called waterfall. It's a waterfall structure. It's a waterfall financial structure. So they each have it each individual Rockefeller descendant has a life insurance policy. And then they get a set amount from the Rockefeller Institution to do their own philanthropy, but it has to be along certain lines, right? There's guidelines in which they can individually go out and invest, right? Here's your left and right limits. Now go forth and do good things, right? Or do bad things, or do whatever you're going to do, but it's in line with the Rockefeller goals. Now they go out there. Now, when they pass away, the life insurance pays out a certain amount back into the trust, and it's guaranteed that money that they had out there. So whatever they spend plus the life insurance, because of the insurance policy they have, goes back into the foundation. So that foundation, even outside of the investments, just in the life cycle of the descendants, makes money. Now, they don't always run it. They're not always the president, but they have some deciding factors. But the president comes in outside of the family, usually looks at the charter and says, okay, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to guide and shape the vision going forward based upon the charter. And the charter gets reviewed. They have their own what do you call it? The charters. In fact, let me go to that. I'm gonna break free from this just for a second, and we're going to share the screen because I do want to show you a couple things. One is the actual foundation charter of the Rockefeller Foundation, and it's interesting because the first goal that they have. So this is actually the charter itself, and you can find this over in the archive.org. Go in there, and there's a number of Rockefeller documents that they filed that you can actually look at their documents, because it is a Rockefeller Foundation. So like any nonprofit, they have to be able to do this. The numbers are staggering. This is 1914 numbers, right? So you multiply it by about 19 times that today's dollars. This is a tremendous amount of money. Depending on the year, definitely the first year, they're giving more money, more foreign aid than the United States government was up to a certain point. And depending on the year, they were definitely giving more. So this is the structure. It definitely has how they're going to go forward, what they're going to do. But the interesting part is almost the very first thing that they do is they set up in chapter 1 is this is their founding document. The very beginning, they refer back to the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission in 1909 for the eradication of hookworm disease. This is important. And they want the International Health Commission created June 27, 1913 by the Rockefeller Foundation. So they create another health commission. The Rockefeller Foundation is all about health. Why? 2 reasons. Number one, if you are looking at a person's health, that is the most, how can I say, intrusive, that is the most influential in a person, right? If you begin to control their health, as everyone knows now from 2020 and COVID, right? Once you start getting in that decision cycle, or that in the government, in the society, and in the individual, that's a tremendous amount of control. It's also a tremendous amount of profit. And they realize that there's a lot of money and control and influence you can buy and get with eradication of disease and those sorts of things. So one of the things they did first, we'll get into that, but that's in their very charter. So we can actually see as far as motive. Remember means, motive, opportunity? Well, the means they definitely have. In fact, it's almost everything you need for means, motive, opportunity is in one document. They put it all right here. There's not much detective work you have to do. Do they have the means? Yeah, it's more than the U.S. government was giving out for foreign aid, right? And it continued over, about 100 years. They've still, depending on the year, they've given out foreign aid. So they're already giving the China Medical Board. They're already beginning to do Romania. They were trying to, at the end of World War One, they were actually going in and shaping Romania. Industrial relations, they were setting up a new religion. I mean, there was just tremendous amounts of effort and lines of effort that all of these different groups were going through, and they lay it out. Here it is. This is everything. You have the names, you have the network, you have what they're going to do, and you have their motives. So they definitely had the means. They had the opportunity because they were there during the period when medicine was still a frontier science. So they were able to kind of be at the forefront of development of vaccines, of sanitary, of eugenics, of abortion. If they had done this 200 years earlier, they wouldn't have had that power. They wouldn't have had the opportunity because the world and society wasn't at that point. Now they were, and they were taking it by storm. So again, go to archive.org details. They've got pretty good one on that. You can look up the Rockefeller corporate filings. The other thing, or foundation filings, the other thing you can do is the Rockefeller Foundation itself on their website. They have their own archives with letters and documents and everything like that. They don't hide it. It's all out in the open, which makes it interesting into, why that was there. And I don't know if that showed up. Let's see. Hang on just a second. Here we go. There we go. I forgot to add to the screen. So let me go back and show this to you one last time. So again, there's the archive.org up at the top. And we'll go back to the beginning here. So Rockefeller Foundation is the first report. It was formed in 1913. And then this is their yearly report that was filed. And as I said, it's really fascinating to look through because it shows at each period of time what their focus was. And you'll notice that a lot of governments begin to follow the Rockefeller model. So what Rockefeller would do, the Rockefeller Foundation would put a lot of money into one year, either 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 7 years later, then the governments follow suit. So it was always kind of Rockefeller was kind of leading many nations as far as what their policies were. So he was definitely shaping nations. And we can see the evidence of that here, where they give money. They literally say what they're going to do. And then other nations will begin to follow suit. Then you get all these other trend lines in here. And we'll go over some of those in a minute. But it was over 3. They were definitely looking at that because you can see here, it shall be within the purpose of said corporation, which is Rockefeller Foundation, to use as means to that end research, publication, establishment and maintenance of charitable, benevolent, religious, missionary, and public educational activities, agencies and institution, and the aid of any such activities, agencies and institutions already established in any other means and agencies which from time to time shall seem expedient to its members or trustees. Right? So they've literally, here it is set in there. And then he goes into, more of the ideology that they have. They have mental hygiene, war relief. They were working because of the first year of the war, but mental hygiene, right? In other words, mental health, right? We call it mental health nowadays. So from the get-go, from the very first, they're looking at health, physical health. They're looking at mental health. And as we'll see, they were looking at kind of religion and worldview and what they're going to do. And it's, again, you have to remember that these guys were coming out of a Baptist tradition that was not the same Baptist tradition as today. Most people associate Baptists with kind of conservatives. There was that socialist Christian movement at the late 19th century, early 20th century. And they came from that line. They weren't total Christian socialists, but they definitely incorporated a lot of socialist theory within their thoughts. And it definitely was that there needs to be a control. Individual rights was kind of, let by the wayside. It was the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And you can see that. But a lot of support came through the YWCA. They support YMCA. So a lot of organizations they could support with that. So even if the Rockefeller Foundation wasn't planting their flag and going forward, they were supporting other groups that would, like the Red Cross, and they had a lot of money to be able to help them. They could give a budget for a year, and you'll see who they support and when they support them. Tells you a lot about what their goals were and kind of where we are today. And so there's the Constitution. You can look at it. Like I said, Chapter 1, as I mentioned earlier, but I want to show you guys. Letters of gift. Let me go forward. It's health, right? Number 1 is health because that is the most controlling model that you can do is if you control somebody's health, which includes food, which includes your medicine, which includes preventive medicine, it includes behavior, right? So that's the biggest model. It includes surveillance, right? The hookworm. So we'll go into that here in a minute. I'll just go ahead and dive into that. The hookworm epidemic, as they called it down in the South of the United States, was their first goal. It was actually predated the Rockefeller Foundation. It was what Rockefeller did on his own. And he went down there and basically set up a team that was wanting to eradicate hookworms in the South. And the way to do that was changing behavior, right? So normally hookworms, anybody will tell you, just put shoes on, right? Go and put shoes on, sweep your floors, right? But he wanted to go in depth. And so they wanted a surveillance program in the homes. Keep in mind, this is 1909 in the South of the United States. And they want to establish surveillance in people's houses so they understand how they live. They do surveys. They look at cleanliness, how many kids, what's the relationship, all of these sorts of things. It's a massive intrusive surveillance program with the guise of, okay, we're going to try to eradicate hookworm. Okay, we'll put shoes on, sweep your floors. That's it, right? But no, they want to go in there and be able to get a lot more information. And information back then was still power. Now it's even more. I mean, information is the new gold. But they were also doing medical work in China. So they were looking at how to be able to shape kind of the China, which had just gone into revolution in 1911. So China was seen as ripe for development and exploitation, shaping, and control by a lot of people, including the Rockefellers. Now, they would do it under the guise of medical, but the end goal was some form of control or influence. The other thing is no foreign aid was given without some form of quid pro quo. So, for example, if they went down and they helped Brazil with massive amounts of immunizations, as we'll talk about here shortly, they were getting resources out of Brazil. They were going to get some form of innovations back. I said YMCAs everywhere. There's a YMCA or YWCA. Part of that was it. There's a lot of foreign ministry work in Japan. It's interesting. Japan was a target of the Rockefeller Foundation for decades. And they wanted to focus on first population reduction. They literally wanted to stop the growth of Japanese population and then reduce it. For whatever reason, they wanted to go and focus on that first. It was China, India, and Japan, just reduce the population. And they actually worked in the 1920s with Japanese proto-feminists. They were kind of the pioneer feminists, and they were working on them to radicalize them even further and to get them to agree to, hey, abortion's a good thing, reduce population through, various things. What did they say? It was Margaret Sanger. They actually funded Margaret Sanger to go over to Japan a number of times and try to organize what became Planned Parenthood in Japan very early. And so that was interesting. And then if you fast forward about 50 years, there was John J. Rockefeller who went to Japan for about a year to study. So they've maintained kind of an interest in Japan because they're kind of part of that global international movement that doesn't like strong, independent kind of cultures. They like cultures that are more modeled. And even though Japan is somewhat accommodating, it maintained its own cohesiveness for a long time and would incorporate foreign elements without subsuming themselves to foreign elements, and therefore was a threat to a lot of groups. But that's another topic. But we'll get into that probably in another talk. But as I said, just a tremendous amount of focus, a lot of money. So means, motive, opportunity is literally almost all here. You can see the International Health Commission where they worked in. They established the Rockefeller Health Commission, International Health Commission, June 27, 1913. They worked with the United Nations after World War I. They worked with the United Nations after World War II. And it wasn't just the health. It wasn't just bodily health. Like I said, it was also the culture. It was the mind. It was a whole series of basically very intrusive, controlling kind of, full spectrum control and shaping operations, as we would say. But there it is. So like I said, recommend it. I don't know if you see it up top, archive.org. That's the place to go. Take a look. They also got their archives on their own website at Rockefeller Foundation. So you can take a look at that. So that gives you an idea about kind of the scale, even from the get-go, right? So it didn't need a lot of priming of the pump. It was coming out of the gate hot and heavy with kind of this global program with equivalent of now billions of dollars to be able to shape everything from the medicine you take, from the clothes you wear, from the family structure to what you believe. And we'll get into that here in a minute. And again, it wasn't just the Rockefellers. We're here looking at just some of the associations that would use, a lot of front companies. And then who came from the Rockefeller. If you were an alumni of this, you probably were indoctrinated to some degree within the Rockefeller method and within Rockefeller's ideals. And you're going to get money. For example, one of the health initiatives, right when it came out, when the Rockefeller Foundation started, there was a number of natural remedy and homeopathic courses within college. So medicine, you could choose what they called scientific or industrial medicine, or you could study homeopathic or natural medicine. Rockefeller targeted the natural and homeopathic. Why? Because his was industrial medicine, right? Pharmaceuticals that were kind of petroleum based, and that they were more industry. They weren't natural, right? You're going to make a profit off of them, right? And to some dubious degree, we'll get in here to a second, but that was his model. So he had to crush the competition just like he'd done in the oil industry. And that meant all your docs, your country docs that used to go around and say, there's, 90% of everything's going to be preventive medicine, right? And then for emergencies, maybe we can go over to scientific and industrial medicine. But Rockefeller wanted to flip that, pretty much eradicate all the country of the preventive medicine and go, no, everything's going to be an emergency, and you're going to have to take all of this, industrial medicine. It's going to cost a lot of money. And then some of the cures were worse than the disease. And so he would create problems on problems with some of the experimentation that they did in these sorts of things. However, why did people listen to it? Well, John Hopkins, he would fund a tremendous amount of research, and they did do some good. They did make some breakthroughs. They would fund through the University of Chicago. They would bring in a lot of the European experts. They did bring in a lot of money and a lot of people and a lot of minds to solve problems. But because of their advocacy, they pushed out a lot of things that probably didn't need to be pushed out. And everybody now can recognize this from 2020. But back in the day, a lot of people didn't understand. They thought it couldn't happen, right? If he's giving to charity, it must be 100% good. It can be good and bad. The other thing to remember is within that network, what I meant to say was look at Bill Gates's father. He was part of that Rockefeller group. He believed in depopulation. And the other thing we'll get into is there's an interesting connection that Bill Gates has picked up one of the programs that Rockefeller Foundation was pioneering, which was the genetic modification of mosquitoes, right? In order to prevent the spread of certain mosquito-borne viruses, right? So that was a Rockefeller initiated, but then Bill Gates kind of picked up the torch and he's running with it. So it's kind of interesting. As I said, you can really break down most of the Rockefeller programs into three fundamental focuses, right? The body, the mind, and the soul. They wanted to basically shape and create a body, mind, and soul for the entire globe, right? They thought we're citizens of the world. A couple of Rockefellers made very disparaging remarks about the United States, about United States society, and they wanted to reshape this, right? And so the body, we can definitely see it: health, medicine, pharma. The mind is social shaping, operational conditioning, model behavior. They looked at how human beings can be conditioned. And then the soul, there was actually a unified church movement that Rockefeller was doing. He literally was trying to create a universalist religion, right? So before Sun Myung Moon, there was Rockefeller. So, and we'll start with that one first. We'll actually start with the soul first, because I found it the most fascinating. I had no idea this was part of it. I knew the financial, I knew the medical, but I had no idea about this. So Rockefeller created supported massively the interchurch world movement. And what that was he wanted to unite mostly the Protestants. He said, but there were some he called them like-minded Catholics and like-minded Jews, Reformed Jews, that he said, could come over into there. But, you had to follow these principles, right? So he's basically creating a new religion. And it was the interchurch world movement. The high point was really after World War I. He, as a direct contributor, he kind of moved away from that, but the foundation supported other organizations that were looking for kind of this this Unitarian movement within Christianity to move it. And actually was transcending Christianity, as we'll see, because it took, for example, the Catholics, and it literally upended them, right? So there was kind of a long march through Catholic institutions, initially in America and most likely the world, that would change them, because the primary focus of the Rockefeller Foundation and Rockefeller's personal beliefs, and many of his descendants' personal beliefs, was that human beings are killing the planet. There's too many of us, and too many of the wrong type of us, and we have to kind of cull the herd. And so that was antithetical to many of the fundamentalist Christians and the Catholics, and many of the Orthodox Jews. That's you shouldn't do that. So what did he do? Well, he said, okay, I'll create an alternative where you can have this kind of belief in a higher power, and you say you can do birth control and you can do abortions. And that argument has been going on for decades. In fact, still goes on today, but Rockefeller kind of waded into it, and it gave it a tremendous push on the abortion and the birth control with his money. And we'll see a thing here right now. This is how he did it. And this is a good case study for the influence of Rockefeller and how he can get inside organizations, and you'll think that organization did it on its own. So about 1962, so in the early 60s, there was actually a number of government initiatives promoted by Rockefeller and politicians, actually kind of on both sides of the aisle, for legalizing abortion and saying, okay, the government is going to provide contraceptives. Now, where are you going to buy those contraceptives from? If you're a government agency, from a Rockefeller group. or a Rockefeller Group affiliated, organization. So he's going to make money off of it, and he's going to be able to shape the United States. There's some things he did beforehand to kind of prime the pump. We'll get into those, but I want to show you this. So the Catholics were the largest opponent of the Rockefeller initiatives at the government level, right? So the Catholic voting bloc was pretty significant back at this time. And he saw that, or the Rockefeller Foundation saw that as the biggest impediment to getting these anti-abortion and the contraceptive legalized within America. So they said, okay, what are we going to do? Well, they came up with pretty much what he did in the oil industry. So they went down to the largest Catholic university, right? Notre Dame. Fighting Irish, right? So the Notre Dame, he goes down there, and there was a father that ran it, a priest that ran it, and I apologize to any Catholic listeners out there, but this may be upsetting. You may want to turn off right now. But this father basically betrayed the entire church for money. Now, he's kind of lionized down there at Notre Dame, but the facts are the facts, and this is where it leads to. So what he ended up doing was he set up a secret meeting, and he said, look, I want you to host some population control councils. I want you to some population control conferences at Notre Dame, because what the Rockefeller organization needed was basically a token of the Catholics, an influential Catholic group, to get to their side so that they could sway the rest of the Catholics. Remember, we talked about Edward Bernays, I think, a little last week. We definitely talked about him in the book there. Edward Bernays was a propagandist for Woodrow Wilson, and after the war, he said that propaganda needs to be maintained in order for democracy, as he called it, to continue. And that was convincing from the oligarchs, convincing or selling your idea to the people. And he says, you don't have to convince 100 people all the time. I just need to know who the influences are and convince them, and they'll do the rest, right? And so this was the Rockefeller method. I just need to get the one guy or the one institution on my side, and they're going to influence thousands, and then we're good to go. So in 1962, he went down and he said, "Okay, I'm gonna convince this." And unfortunately, it's very sad, but Theodore Hesburgh, who was a priest and much beloved at Notre Dame still, I think, said, "Yeah, sure," but he did it on the down low, right? So they held meetings, and guess what? That guy let Planned Parenthood in there. Now, if you're a Catholic, right, nowadays, most people don't understand it, but back in the 60s, early 60s, in the Catholic institution in the United States, Notre Dame, and you're a priest, and you say, yeah, sure, come on in, let's do it. So he utilized the University of Notre Dame, a Catholic university, to essentially endorse, because he let him in the door, and he said, yeah, we'll hold some population conferences here. And that tacit endorsement allowed legitimacy, and that was kind of the camel's nose in the tent that then gets that ball rolling federally, that eventually, within short order, the Rockefeller campaigns get so that abortion is legalized, and you have contraceptive that is purchased in some cases by the federal government or state governments, but it's legal, and you're going to buy from him. So that's pretty good. Pretty good campaign if you think about it, right? That's influence operations. Now, what happened to Father Hesburgh? You'd think, well, okay, was he fired by the Pope? I mean, when you go against the papal decrees, usually you get fired, right? I mean, look at Vigano recently, right? And again, I'm not Catholic, I apologize, but that's what it seems to me. That's what would happen. Well, no, instead, he gets a position on the Chase Bank board. Remember, after J.P. Morgan died, Chase kind of went over to the Rockefeller Foundation. He also gets he gets the Presidential Freedom Award, and then he gets the Congressional Gold Medal from Bill Clinton. Side note, Bill Clinton got his draft deferment from Vietnam from the Rockefeller Foundation. So there's influence there. So when Bill Clinton's in there, he's a little bit beholden to the Rockefeller Foundation, and that's what they're going to do. If you'll notice up there's a little brochure in the upper right for that interchurch movement. So the interchurch movement knew that Catholicism was a impediment, right? So the traditional conservative Christianity and Judaism was an impediment to his kind of global new shaping new world order kind of thing, right? Now I'll use those words because that's kind of what they used, right? That's what they were saying. We have to shape a new world or a new planet for humanity to save it. But look at that. And the other thing is this Father Hesburgh, he got 150 honorary degrees from universities. That's more than any other person in history. And he wasn't a genius. I mean, it's not like Stephen Hawking, right? He's Stephen Hawking, okay, I could see, or a great philosopher. Right? What did he do? He basically went against his own religion, his own organization, right? He said, to heck with you. And he hosted these conferences. Not only did he do that, but what's not here is he did a Land O'Lakes statement. He used to go out to this place called Land O'Lakes, kind of like the butter, but that was his retreat. He would go out to this little country retreat and go out to the countryside. And the Pope in Rome, who was the head of the Catholic Church actually has a hierarchy, right? Unlike, Judaism or some other religions that are very decentralized. But they have a hierarchy. And so whatever the Pope says, that becomes the doctrine, the law, the rules for the global Catholic organization. So the Pope was drafting up a papal decree that said, okay, abortion, no, birth control only under the most strictest of conditions where the mother's life, you have to save a life, right? In other words, it's not just for convenience. So that was the Catholic Church's decree. Well, Father Theodore Hesburgh gets wind of this, and he goes, "Okay, I'm going to issue the Land O'Lakes Statement, which is open rebellion to the Pope, and says, hey, to heck with you. We're going to be different over here in America. Yeah, do what you want, right? Give in to that, and just do what you want to do." And so, but he wasn't kicked out of the church. Instead, he was given all of these things. I mean, the endorsements by numerous presidents. He had ceremonies everywhere from Nixon to Bill Clinton, Obama, everybody, right? And 150 honorary degrees. He also got 20 years. He sat on the board. He got a board position on the Rockefeller Foundation. So you've got your finger in the decision in the $1 billion funding pie, right? This guy was given pretty much the keys to the kingdom for selling out his own churches, his own religion's belief system, right? In opposition to that chain of command, right? Now, normally in the military, it gets you 15-6, right? In Vigano's case, I think it was Archbishop Vigano, he did far less than this, and he got moved out of the church. So, the politics of that. Now, it's interesting because we're very curious. We're kind of looking at, well, what's going on now? How much of the influence of this foundation and others are perhaps at work now as we decide, or the Catholics decide, on who is going to be the next pope to take over after Francis. And you definitely see a shift of the Catholic Church from this time forward more towards this kind of new order that the Rockefeller Foundation was supporting, funding, and promoting. And so he was transforming the Catholic Church to become more in line with this interchurch kind of universalist church movement. Now we're not done with him because he literally, Father Hesburgh he was definitely in a one world speech. He said world citizens, Harvard University, but he wasn't talking in religious terms. He was talking in more political. He became affiliated with United World Federalists. 1974 became also the advisory board of an organization called Planetary Citizens. And it was right across from the Delegates' Interest to the United Nations, right? Which Rockefeller very much involved with, because that's also a front company, so to speak, the same way that Cromwell was making front companies for him with oil. Well, these are front companies for the Rockefeller Foundation in some ways, and you could kind of subcontract it in some ways to the United Nations. You provide funding, you provide matching goals and things like that. We'll work together. NGOs, it's a massive kind of an org chart in this thing. It's phenomenal, but it gets things done. It gets a global shaping, and nobody really pays attention to it. And then Father Hesburgh himself was appointed to serve as ambassador to the 1979 U.S. Conference on Science and Technology for Development. First time a priest has stormed a formal diplomatic road for the United States government. I'm still surprised what financial acumen he had to get on the Chase Bank board, right? In other words, these are rewards. This is a gift, right? You kiss the ring of the mob boss, and there you go. That's him up there with Obama talking globalism. So we've talked about the soul. Now let's go into the body. Rockefeller attempts a universal health system. This started before the Rockefeller Foundation actually started. Like I said, the hookworm started it, but it's social control, because hookworm was all about not just put shoes on and sweep your floors, but he wanted to know what they ate. He wanted to influence their diet. He was talking about preventive cures and things like, or preventive medicine and all sorts of things. So in other words, he was creating a dependency model and kind of a surveillance and dependency model far in advance of 2020. Influence operations, in other words, I can control behavior, and it was profitable, right? So those are the three big things that they had to look for. Now, what are some of the case studies from this one? Some of the case studies are very interesting. Number one, as we already mentioned, hookworm program in the South. Right after that, he wanted to follow up that somewhat success. It reduced it, didn't eliminate it, but he claims it reduced it. There's a yellow fever epidemic. Yellow fever was going on for a while. Now, Panama, going back to Panama, the surgeon in Panama, Colonel Gorgas, had learned in Cuba during the Spanish-American War that it was the mosquito, and a very specific Aedes aegypti mosquito, that carries certain diseases, another form that carries another disease. So you eradicate that specific, or eliminate the proximity from humans of that specific mosquito, and you've reduced a lot of the problems, right? And so that was Gorgas, and that's why the United States didn't have the casualties in building the Panama Canal that France did, right? We pretty much eliminated malaria and yellow fever by the last few years of the building of the Panama Canal. It was negligible, right? A couple cases, that's it. Up from the tens of thousands that were just wiping out the French there, and that was due to mosquito control and being able to cut your grass, get the water, no standing water around you, or you put chemicals in the water, put fish in the water of standing water to make sure they eat the mosquito larvae, lots of things like that, and understanding the behavior of mosquitoes. So that was already done. But Rockefeller says, well, there's not really a lot of profit in that. So what is he going to do? He's going to make a vaccine for yellow fever. So that's what he's looking for. So yellow fever vaccine. Now, the first one they tried actually discontinued it in the 1920s because it just didn't have any effect. The French came up with a vaccine through the Pasteur Institute after that, but it gave people neurological problems. So that didn't go very far. And then the one that was ready about 1937 was called Rockefeller 17D. It was a yellow fever vaccine. And it was ready to roll out. Well, and this is an interesting timeline. In January of 1941, now this is very interesting because then the history, and even on the Rockefeller history, they say that January 1941 in World War II, America was worried about Japan dropping mosquitoes all over the United States troops and that they would get yellow fever. So we have to vaccinate them to be prepared against yellow fever that the Japanese are going to drop in these mosquitoes. We weren't at war in January of 1941. We were at war in January 1942. That's in multiple documents. So far, we're still looking into it, but it doesn't look like a typo. They were promoting to the government to get the soldiers that were being indoctrinated, to give them, soldiers and sailors and Marines, to give them a shot of this vaccine is kind of mandatory as part of their in processing against this hypothetical threat of the Japanese and yellow mosquitoes, which came from no intel source, right? At that time, it was just this crazy hypothetical, but no threat or no scare should go unwasted for profit. And that's what he did. So he created a scare. He created the fear, and then he said, okay, we're gonna stick them. And during the mobilization in 1941, when the United States Army was mobilizing, so they pulled up about 1 million soldiers, and then they went to Louisiana maneuvers during the summer, fall of 1941, and then of course Pearl Harbor hits in December 7, 1941. All of those, the preliminary guys, the ones that went to the Philippines, everybody got a shot of yellow fever. So at the end of this thing, in about 3 years, 7 million United States servicemen were given this Rockefeller 17D shot. About 800,000 known, and there's probably a lot more unknown, developed hepatitis B because of it, right? So it was tainted. 800,000 that we know of got hepatitis B. And that wasn't released until the Veterans Administration started in the 70s and 80s going, hey, there's a pattern here, right? They look at pattern analysis and they go, we think this is service related because it's showing up disproportionately in the veteran population from the specific deployment in 1941 through, the mobilization of 41 through the deployments in 42 and 43. And then they look back and they say, wait a minute. And they proved, yep, it was definitely tainted with hepatitis B, including General Stilwell. Remember fighting Vinegar Joe Stilwell of Burma? He got hepatitis B from this vaccine. So it was the secondary effect. Now, Veterans Administration took care of it, but it should have been the Rockefeller Foundation. They got bazillions of dollars. So, but again, it was kind of rushing things out there, and they were basically using the U.S. as a test bed. The U.S. military was a test bed to see if this thing was effective or not. And then they gave probably, depending on the numbers you look at, between 10 to 20 million of those to the country of India. Now, remember, there's a lot of things you'll see in here with some of the medical and health initiatives are designed in some ways to reduce population. So creating hepatitis B, I'm not saying it's directly related, but it does serve a benefit. Whether it's accidental or intentional, I don't know. But it is the fact that there was hepatitis B within that Rockefeller 17D. 800,000 American soldiers and sailors and Marines got it. Unknown amount of Indians probably got it during that. And within India, there's less chance of them being able to diagnose it and to treat it, which can lead to cancers and kidney failure and all sorts of problems. So we mentioned before he destroyed, or the Rockefeller Foundation was responsible for reducing homeopathy natural resources in the country docks. Now it's funny because 100 years later, we're realizing that preventive medicine with a lot of those natural preventive resources like Whole Foods and things like that, that's actually very important, right? That's important for maintenance so you don't get sick and you don't have to go to the ER. But that was reversed under kind of the Rockefeller initiatives. Why? Because there's no money in that. We saw it in 2020 again, right? Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine. What happened, right? Those were put down. Why? Because it's 10 cents for a pill of ivermectin. But if you do remdesivir, well, that's 10,000 to 15,000 a pop, and some profit for the hospital. So again, organizational structure will dictate the outcome. He focused on industrial petroleum medicine even to this day. There's also a lot in Japan. He was hitting the rice, the GHQ in Japan. This is another interesting part. GHQ in Japan So a lot of Americans are like, oh, look, we created Japan. Japan was very civilized before World War II. They had a functioning democracy. They were able to build aircraft carriers in advance of most nations. We actually copied a lot of their innovation technologically. They were very, very good at what they did, and they could task organize within technical sides very good. Now, they can't get the Army and the Navy to talk to one another, but or anybody to talk to the Prime Minister. But within their little circles, they were remarkable at being able to adapt to conditions, and they were very healthy. The Japanese were some of the longest lived people on Earth, and it was very fascinating because there was a propaganda video just a few years ago made by the Rockefeller Foundation about how they have changed Japan health. And they said at the end of World War II, the average life expectancy of the Japanese male was 24 years old. Now it is up to 7. I'm like, well, wait a minute. At the end of World War II, of course, because most Japanese males were in the military and they're getting wiped out, right? Those are war-related deaths, not health deaths, right? That's not a health casualty. It's not because he got sick. It's basically either malnutrition because we're starving him out, or he's stepping on a landmine or getting shot or getting bayoneted, right? That's the reality of it, and that's why the body count was so low or so high, and your median age of death was low because that takes the war into account. It was not a normal function. You go before then, and there were centenarians, lots of centenarians, or people lived over 100 within Japan, especially in Okinawa. And that was based on whole foods, get a lot of vitamin D, get out there in the sun, some, basic, not a lot of exercise, but movement, right? You got to move up and down and you keep that going, and social networks around your family that you feel both needed and you feel the need of other people, right? So that relationship within the family does a lot for your mental health that affects your physical health. And now we've recognized that. But back in the day, Rockefeller was very involved in the GHQ process to basically make Japan kind of a lab, like a guinea pig. So it introduced a lot of medicines. It introduced wheat. So it took out even the Japanese salt. They transferred the salt because it created a bacteria within the stomach. I mean, that was the level of they wanted to change the gut biome of the Japanese to make them susceptible. Right. In other words, they're very resilient. That was one thing they had. They had basically nothing in World War II, but they were very resilient. And so part of it was kind of a weakening of the physical body and the mental and moral of Japan after war in GHQ. Right. So it was the breakdown of the family. So what they tried before in 1920 with Margaret Sanger kind of creating a cell within Japan of like-minded people with a kind of the prototype Planned Parenthood, that didn't work. And so after the war, they put it in because now it had full effect of GHQ, the American GHQ, to go, okay, you will do this. And America owned it from 45? It was occupied from 45 to 53. And afterward, essentially Japan, this is unfortunate, but it's accurate, was a puppet state and probably still is. And those social structures that were put in place in GHQ maintained themselves. The Japanese, their version of oligarchs, maintained it because they want that sweet, sweet Rockefeller money, and they want some, the U.S. protection money, right? So that's what happens. But unfortunately, the Japanese people have suffered, and that's still going on. There's still a lot of problems. There was wheat. They were forcing in foods with pesticides on it, saying, you need to have fair trade. Food protection laws were breaking down. Again, a lot of pressure for economics versus, hey, these are good health outcomes for the people of that nation. And if you look at the overall arch of the Rockefeller Foundation, they want to break down national barriers. That's a point. Why? Because it's a better economic model for them, right? If to shape the world, you need to reduce the barriers between nations. And they say it over and over. I mean, I'm not making anything up. That's what the Rockefellers talk about. And so that was part of a lot of that goes on. They reduce the country docks, they reduce natural medicine, they reduce the ability of human beings to be able to take care of themselves socially and to take care of themselves in small groups, which they naturally affiliate with, and to keep good health outcomes. I'm responsible. It has to be an economic dependency model that they do in many things that they do because it's a control model, right? They want this kind of global. They wanted a one world government. They said it. They wanted a one world religion. They were fun. They had their own organization at first, the Interfaith or the Interchurch Council, and then they funded others that do it even to this day. So again, just follow the money. What are they putting the money by? Follow their own pronouncements on their website. Go to their website. They got a YouTube channel. Look it up. Rockefeller Foundation. Look it up. Watch those videos, and everything I'm telling you, they literally say it themselves. And then the final one was eugenics, birth control, and abortion. Now, I'm not going to go too much into this, but this one is probably the most damning and what most people see about with the Rockefeller Foundation. So the Rockefeller, like I said, way early said, we want the population of the United States, or the world, and they were focused on Japan, China, and India, reduce that population, stop its growth, reduce its population. That was their focus. And then it basically became global. And then they had to, as you saw earlier, they have to reduce the Catholic Church and other fundamentalist churches that want a right to life, so to speak. They said, no, we're not going to do that. And we're going to alter that. We're going to do this long march within, co-opt it with big money. And they did. And so that changed the attitudes of America. I heard once in 2011, I think there was a poll, and about 98% of the Catholics were using birth control, right? Which is phenomenal if you think that that's, the transformation from 1963 to 2011. And again, part of that was Rockefeller. But going back into this thing with the eugenics, birth control, and abortion, they were all about this before, because the culling was not just a random culling of population. It was the certain types of people they had to cull and others they had to cultivate. And that was eugenics. And that title has gone away from Planned Parenthood and everything. But if you look at Sanger, if you look at some of the early groups in there, and there's a tremendous history on that. It's a lot more than one woman. She was groomed, supported, and promoted by a big organization behind her, right? It wasn't one woman out there doing this stuff. There was a huge support network getting her out there. And in some cases, she was just a front person, a puppet. And there were other groups that were actually using this with international councils, a lot of it Rockefeller money, but others as well. But what they said was, we need a test bed. Remember, they used the U.S. military as a test bed for that Rockefeller 17D. They used Brazil. They used India. Well, guess what now they're going to do? Well, they used eugenics. And hey, guess what? And we'll get into this in 2 weeks. There's actually basically a number of oligarch systems in the U.S. that supported both the Bolsheviks and the National Socialists in Germany. So the Bolsheviks in Russia and the National Socialists in Germany, you'd think those two were opposed to one another. They actually weren't, except at certain times in certain political spheres, and then in World War II at the end. But both of those were financed and funded by a lot of corporations that were interested in the technical benefit. And in a nutshell, just real quick, at the end of World War I, the United States benefited tremendously from Germany. This is Imperial Germany before they turned Nazi, right? Because the German ingenuity was just phenomenal. And so we took a lot of the intellectual property rights as war reparations or as payment, because we were giving them loans. So the United States gave them loans because they're broke, and they got to pay off Britain and France and some other countries. And they didn't have any money. So we gave them loans, and then they pay off Britain and France, and then Britain and France pay off America. We're double dipping. Genius, right? But what happened was, there's a lot of information there. So they knew that the scientific and engineering and research infrastructure in Germany was such that to test eugenics, it was something that they wanted to do. So there was a tremendous investment from Rockefeller into IG Farben. And IG Farben, people know as Bayer. They were the ones that they traded. So Rockefeller would give them a lot of information about petropharmaceuticals and petro derivatives. So, what do you do with petroleum? You could do this and that with it. And a lot of the synthetics that Rockefeller was very, very good at being able to produce on its own, going all the way back to those barrels of kerosene that Rockefeller was making when he was younger. They were very good at that innovation. So IG Farben said, okay, we're going to trade you that. At the same time, a lot of the technology was then used for Zyklon gas, which was used in some of the gas chambers. Also, there was the abortion drug. Make sure I get the right name here. But the abortion drug was also developed as a means to be able to keep populations down. So you could give them this medicine, and they become sterile, right? And later on, that became a birth control pill, right? And later on, the abortion pill was also a derivative of this. But this was the birth control pill that they were using in the beginning. And so that was a business deal, but it was within line for a lot of the focus that Rockefeller the Rockefeller Foundation had within it. So they had no qualms about that. And so you see globally that they're attempting to reduce the population of Japan by fundamentally changing the culture. Didn't work before World War II, but after World War II, they had a captive audience, and they were able to transform the Japanese fundamental behaviors, food intake, and how they saw medicine in order to be able to do that. It was harder in Japan, but they definitely got GHQ to buy off on it. And then the Japanese federal side mirrored a lot of that because they wanted that sweet fight, Rockefeller dollars. In Germany, it occurred during the Nazi period, where there was a partnership. There were many partnerships actually between some of the American corporations and Nazi Germany. But among that was eugenics, specifically Rockefeller, IG Farben, that used that they were able to do those kinds of exchanges. And then the technical data was then used for a lot more of the eugenics outside of that, as well as birth control and abortion. So the technology that was derived is still being used today in some cases. So it was quite interesting. Now, the mind. So we have the soul, we have the body, now the mind. What do they want to do? Well, of course, the Bureau of Social Hygiene. So they said, this is how you have to do, this is what you need to do, this is how you have to do it. And that sounds kind of reasonable. Okay, make sure that people wash their hands, they understand disease vectors. Can't really argue with that much. But they also identified, groomed, and funded and promoted Margaret Sanger, which said, okay, abortions. And she said that pregnancy is biological slavery. That was her big line. Pregnancy is biological slavery. So it was the cultural change for females, for women, not to have babies. For men, don't marry, right? In other words, they were disrupting the family, but they were targeting very specific socioeconomic demographics, right? Japan was one, India, China, and then eventually it came back home to America. And that's when we kind of woke up, but we were unaware of it and we didn't say anything when we were promoting it on other countries, right? So that was pretty bad. The other thing that most people don't realize is Rockefeller found a little guy. He was just this weird kind of researcher, and they gave him equivalent of $500,000 a year in today's money. And his name was Alfred Kinsey. Now, if you're a certain age group, you're going to know Alfred Kinsey is the guy that did sex education, right? And specifically, he said that everybody is gender fluid and everybody is gay and everybody's bisexual, among males especially. That's what his research was. And the Kinsey Sexual Research and the Kinsey Sex Institute basically was looking at transforming the sexual norms. They started him in 1951. 1941. 1941, during the middle of a war, when they're giving that 17D vaccine to the soldiers. Why in the world would you pick a guy that wants to research sex, and specifically the behavior of sex, and specifically breaking up the normal, sexes for procreation, that sort of thing, and again, it shows the anti kind of traditionalist Catholic, the anti-traditional Jewish, the anti-traditionalist Christian values, that this is just for fun. And that's what Alfred Kinsey basically said. And he says, it doesn't even have to be, it could be any type of thing. In 1941, 1951, of course, he publishes his work. And of course, Rockefeller promotes it. Everybody and their brother, because they get Rockefeller money, is going to say the same thing that Rockefeller Foundation says. Oh, this is great. This is leading edge. This is fantastic. A few years later, the sexual revolution happens, and it begins the slow deterioration of the cohesiveness of the American family. So divorce rates skyrocket. You have a lot of a spread of venereal diseases, and guess what? Rockefeller's got a cure for that. And hey, you don't want to get pregnant outside of marriage, so what do? Guess what? You got to buy contraceptives. Who sells those? Well, guess what? Rockefeller. So they're both creating the problem, and they've got the cure, right? That's a business model, and it's social shaping. Remember that impact investment that they're looking at, the impact philanthropy. That's what they're doing. So that was a huge deal with the Alfred Kinsey. In the 1962, they began to promote transgenderism. Now, if you think about it, if you promote both homosexuality and transgenderism, it's not just a matter of, if one person wants to go off and do that, great. Okay, go do that. There's always been through history, homosexual behavior, both males and females, not just in humans, but in other mammals. There's always been in many cultures a type of a transgenderism, right? So guys will dress up in girls' clothing, they identify, they feel more, but it's always been a reduced population, right? It wasn't put in the forefront, it wasn't promoted, and it wasn't pushed. And the deal was this: in other words, here's a group that wants to promote, don't have, population reduction, right? So population growth, stop, and then reduce the population. If you promote the transitioning, and they did this in the early 60s. Rockefeller was a whole hog on this in the early 60s. If you promote the drug treatment for transitioning, what does that do biologically? They become sterile. We know this now because we've given, unfortunately, the United States pushed this on kids. And if you look back in there, you're going to see a lot of those foundations, that same foundation we showed in the beginning of this, with all of those networks, all of those, was that like 80 different associated foundations tied to the Rockefeller Foundation, are giving money for this transition. But it didn't start with Obama. It didn't start with Biden. It didn't start 10 years ago. It didn't start with Clinton. It started in the 60s. The 1960s was when the Rockefeller Foundation began to fund the social scientists that were promoting transgenderism, to say this should be promoted. And they give them the money, right? All I have to do is give them money. I don't have to say it myself, but follow the money. That's what you always do. Follow the money, follow the promotion, and follow those scientists get promoted and they get positioned, just like they did with Father Hegseth over at Notre Dame, right? How does a priest that runs a college suddenly get a board on Chase Manhattan and the Rockefeller Foundation for 20 years, controlling billions of dollars? Well, you sell out, right? So everybody's going to dance to the piper as long as that piper pays. That's human nature, from mafia groups to criminals to nowadays. And that's exactly what happened with Rockefeller. And it's not just America. For example, in GHQ Japan, they were able to identify kind of those collaborators within Japan, those Father Hegseths in Japan, that looked and said, okay, we're going to change the Japanese, the social organization in Japan. And so you had a tremendous amount of those same programs that are now enacted in the United States were kind of tested out in occupied Japan, put in the forefront. And when Japan had its economic success in the 60s, the Rockefeller Foundation, and of course their ancillary groups, pointed to that and said, hey, look at that success. That's because of us. And the propaganda video I talked about earlier that was just made a few years ago that tried to say that those low life expectancies of the Japanese were due to Rockefeller's industrial medicine and social programs, it literally said the economic, and this was during the boom year. So I think the video was made in 99 or 2001 when there was still kind of the bubble. And the video said this economic miracle of Japan was due to the Rockefeller Group's health and social shaping of Japan. That was the line that they had. So the Japanese success in economics kind of hurt them because they didn't recognize that eventually that will go away. That what they were feeling at that moment was the economic boom that was caused by the early Showa group that hadn't died out yet, that made it through the war, and that they were the ones that were kind of carrying this forward. And then that first generation that was influenced by the Showa group. But as those early Showa people died, that's the early guys in Japan, as that culture had died out, that social organization was dying out in Japan. The new social structure in Japan that was partly influenced by Rockefeller and the front groups that were in Japan from the Rockefeller Foundation, and the food differences and the health differences and all of the social shaping that the Rockefellers did, Japan was not able to pull themselves back up. They didn't have that social cohesion and energy that they had just 10 years earlier or 20 years earlier. That was the real effect of Rockefeller. So they made the video before Japan's bubble economy. There's a lot of other things that went into it, but a fundamental reason why you lose that cohesion within Japan. And some groups are starting to come back, but basically those GHQ babies are kind of that lost generation, and because they were eating more flour than rice, because they were eating less whole foods, they were eating a lot more sugar. You'll see it also in Thailand, where Rockefeller and the United Nations work a lot. There's sugar, there's condensed milk, there's a lot of processed foods that now we know are absolutely bad for you, but yet they'll continue to push those things. And now they push the pharmaceuticals, which also are bad for you. So there's a whole cascading effect. You can make them sicker because it's a dependency model, right? I can socially shape them so I can make them more productive or less productive as I need. And then as the industrial production shifted to basically the slave labor groups of the CCP occupied Asia within the Chinese sphere, now the CHICOM sphere, well, now they didn't need Japan anymore. Why? Because it's too expensive, right? We're just going to get our products from Japan or from China. So there's what happens in Japan, we don't care. So all of these go in there. The other part is, along with these social control models, look at the front and parallel organizations, the Ford Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where Rockefeller puts their money. You'll see Ford Foundation almost always put it right next to it. You'll see the Gates Foundation almost put it right next to it, right? They're almost in tandem. And then about 4, 5, 6 years later, then the government picks up the funding. So they prime the pump, they get it moving, they sell it, they propagandize it, and then the taxpayers will pick up the bill. So when you're looking at history, what I said before, right? Sometimes you're looking at nations and you're like, why are we doing this? Well, you're doing it because the leadership of the nation is influenced or shaped in large part by the oligarchs. And when the oligarchs set up something, so, hey, this is a great idea, we put a lot of money into this, you should probably now fund this. A lot of the leadership of the nation will not listen to the population of the nation. They're going to listen to the oligarchs. They're, okay, that's a great idea. And then they sell it to the nation. and then the nation will pick up the bill. That's the way it's always been. Machiavelli wrote about it. That's why I recommend that book again, The Machiavellian's Defender of Freedom by James Burnham. You're going to look at oligarchical structures and how they shape and interact with national organizations and governments, and that kind of back and forth that happens. So do they shape it? Yeah. Follow the money, follow the programs. If an oligarchy spends billions of dollars setting up this, this interesting social experiment, and then the government follows behind about 7 years later or 10 years later and says, okay, we're going to pick it up and continue it. Well, that's, who's leading who's walking which dog. It's just the way it is. As I said, organizational structure dictates outcome. Look at these things. The domestic political considerations do not matter. The U.S. government will be used in a case to advance oligarch gain. We talked about it before, not so much with Rockefeller because there's so many examples of that. But earlier, the one we talked about last week with Cromwell, right? A lawyer that was able to, who was the lawyer for Rockefeller, who was able to set up a whole nation, right? And the Secretary of State would make public pronouncements or move U.S. ships to promote basically what would be profit for the shareholders of an oligarch. Right. So yeah, you could, you have the ability of the oligarchs to really shape the government, sometimes in opposition to the population. So just keep that in mind when you see things. If government does something you don't understand, look behind them, right? Take a look around the corner, around the back, and say, okay, which oligarch is sitting here pulling those strings and why, and what are they doing? And is it a pattern of behavior or some anomaly, maybe something we're not seeing? But just realize when you look in history, that has been going on for, in America for about 100 years on a consistent scale with Rockefeller, because he had that power about turn of the century. So 1890 to 1914, he's really shaping events. And then it's been the same way ever since. But you have other players in there, Gates, Ford, but they follow along that same line. As I mentioned before, Bill and Melinda Gates Rockefeller Foundation's Foreign Alliance. This is just, this article I think was just a couple of years ago. And basically, look, so they're working in Africa to shape the sociology of Africa, to shape everything through a green revolution. Oh, that's one thing I didn't mention. Big thing now, climate change. Climate change, climate change, climate. The Rockefellers are all about climate change. And part of that is reducing resources and setting up structures so that, again, population is reduced in certain areas, right? In other words, it's eugenics by another name, but they call it a green revolution. They call it climate change. They call it whatever. But it's basically restricting development so that, A, you're dependent upon products from outside. You're never going to develop self-sufficiency or self-dependency on yourself. You're relying on outside for your dependencies. Even as they try to set something up saying, well, we're enabling them or empowering them with this and clean water and the other thing. Yeah, but if they're not making if the pumps aren't being made by the country themselves, you're kind of in a colonial dependency, aren't you? Right? So quite interesting. And the other thing is that they have more buying power, but that buying power goes outside of the country. So always remember there's a quid pro quo, and everywhere that Rockefeller went for probably 20, 30 years in the beginning, they were always getting a resource deal with it. So the resource would come back into the U.S. or wherever they had their use for those resources. And so it was a quid pro quo. So yeah, we're going to give you your guys, 1,000,001 shots of vaccine, but we're going to get we're going to get bananas out of it, or we're going to get diamonds out of it, or we're going to get something out of it. There was always a trade. There was always a quid pro quo. And there's interesting now because they've got this new investment model in other countries where they are going to tie up angel investors with a loan officer to find people that are independently going out saying, I want to put, solar houses or solar panels on all these huts in Africa, and I need $1 million to do it. Well, the entrepreneur or the social engineer takes out a loan from a bank, but normally a bank wouldn't give it to one person that's going to do that. Like, well, it's a risk. So basically the Rockefeller Foundation finds other investors, not even their money anymore. They're finding other investors and saying, okay, I want you to underwrite this so that if they are able to pay off that loan, you're going to give a margin, you're going to give a profit to the bank or the lending institution, right? And that benefits the lending institution. So all they got to do is just collect their money. And so that is now their kind of one of their models for investment. So you're broadening the network even more. And for an investigator side, that's harder to trace, right? Because in other words, if you're looking at who funded this, what was this bank? Okay, but you have to really get into the weeds of the paperwork to go, okay, because it was underwritten by the Rockefeller Institution through this angel investor that said, I'm going to give you a margin after you've recouped your initial loan, so you can get a nice profit margin on that. Now you understand that's a Rockefeller thing. So it's a degree of separation by putting these front organizations or this front mechanism in front. Again, organizational structure dictates outcome, but it can also mask your intent. And so that's something as you're investigating from now forward, you may not see a Rockefeller stamp on it, but there's a Rockefeller stamp on it in the back, right? Just keep that in mind when you're doing your own investigations in that. But throughout history, a lot of it was in the front. There's still a lot of it in the front. That's just one program in Africa that they can kind of maximize their reach. It may not be for hiding. It may just be for maximizing reach, but it makes it difficult to see, okay, what's kind of Rockefeller funded or not. But when you go in the past and you look at those documents, you're definitely going to see Rockefeller Foundation all over the place. Again, pattern over time. All of their programs basically focus on, getting that body in the dependency model, health. They're going to take over the health. They want to get your mind, right? You're going to be thinking about the politics, the outcomes. Everything is shaping it toward basically what Rockefeller does so that you provide profit and, I guess, dependency to a Rockefeller organization or a government that's doing deals with Rockefeller. And then the soul, again, that was the world outlook, how you see the world. In other words, how you frame, is a nation a good thing or a bad thing? Is a family a good thing or a bad thing? Is abortion a good thing or a bad thing, right? And all of these things were pushed and promoted and manipulated by a non-governmental organization, right? It's the Rockefeller Foundation from a guy that was, set up this thing back in, 1913. And his family's in the 7th generation, 260, but they're not the only ones. They're not really running the thing. There is tremendous amounts of people. There are tens of thousands of people in just one or two or three organizations. And you saw, again, that list. In fact, I should probably go back to that list. That list has a tremendous amount that when you look at this, you have to look at what was going on and all of these organizations that are doing it. And I just went to the end and I finished and we're done. Oh man, misfire here somewhere. Okay. Okay. Just ready that music to kind of just pause it a little bit so we can go back. Almost there. Let's review. There will be a test. There we go. Okay. So just like he was good with being able to move those, all of these, and some have the Rockefeller name, some don't. And more you're going to see a lot of organizations that don't. And as I said before, there's a lot of parallel organizations. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Ford Foundation, when the Rockefeller gives, usually these other organizations will give. And so the Rockefeller sometimes just gives a little, like we were looking at the network over in Europe. And so in Germany, they had promotion of a certain medicine. And you're looking at, okay, the Rockefeller gives to these three groups, but they gave a little bit of money. They didn't give a lot, but then Bill and Melinda Gates gave a lot. And then the WEF gave even more. So sometimes it's not proportional. It's just, okay, we're going to spot you at 10. You guys can spot them for the other 100. So just keep in mind when you're doing your research on that throughout history, there's a lot more organizations, and some of them changed their name. So in other words, the Rockefeller University wasn't the Rockefeller University until it rebranded, in the 1910s. So it was something else before. So just keep in mind that these names change, and a lot of these things will alter over time, and different organizations will take the lead on certain promotions at certain times. So just keep that in mind. Okay, and let's go back. So the final one, we've looked at it. We say there's a pattern. Yep, no problem. Tremendous pattern. It's consistent over time. It's in the charter. It's in their very filings that they do. So does it now match up to the MMO, right? Is it means, motive, and opportunity? Means, yeah, absolutely. Heck yes. In other words, billions of dollars. At the start of the operation, it was 1.2% of the American GDP was put into this fund. It had more money than most nations, most European nations. It just had more money. Depending on the year, it gave more foreign money than the United States government did. So does it have the means? Oh yeah. Can they walk in? They had one of the Rockefeller grandson was vice president of the United States. They've had state senators. They've had, folks at all levels in the United Nations. So this, yeah, absolutely. They have both the power and the influential power and the financial power. Do they have the means? Yeah, absolutely. By the best metric ever. It's very, very well documented, very much there. Motives, yes, because they actually put it in their Rockefeller Foundation documents, right? Every year, here's the goal. This is what they do. And then the supporting fund. So the supporting funding. So even if they weren't saying it, watch where they put their money, right? And then you'll see this is their goal. This is what they want to do. So they support and fund and promote people like Margaret Sanger. They support and promote and fund guys like Alfred Kinsey. Well, what do you think is going to happen? And then they turn guys like, Father Hegsworth. Well, what are you going to do? Right? It's very obvious, right? Their motives are absolutely obvious and consistent with oligarchs that are able to shape nations and national and international organizations in isolation from the people of those organizations they're supposed to represent. So it's definitely controlling oligarchy here. Does it pass the MMO opportunity? Yeah, absolutely. So over the past 100 years, when they were in medicine, they pretty much defined medicine. They're the ones that shaped industrial medicine and scientific medicine that we have today. They were the ones that were able to suppress a competing preventive medicine kind of model. So yeah, the opportunity was there because medicine was becoming a big deal. They were the ones that essentially created or promoted or facilitated the sexual revolution and then provided contraceptives and abortion to that. They promoted transgenderism in the 1960s, and then they provided the drugs and the treatments and all of that supporting around that, which is about a $2 billion industry. I think $2.1 billion in 2022. I don't know what it is now. 2022 is about $2.1 billion in transitional. That's the therapies, the medicines, the surgeries, all that. And they promoted that back in, I said 61, and they were consistent throughout. So did they have the opportunity? Yeah, they were right place, right time with the means and the motives to be able to affect that. And it was consistent, definitely over 100 years. So was the opportunity there? Yep, check. Okay, so this one was kind of condensed. Like I said, this was an overview of Rockefeller. This wasn't an in-depth into the weeds. There is so much there. I mean, there's literally chapters and chapters and documents on top of documents for working with I.G. Fairbairn with the Nazis. In 2 weeks from now, we're going to go into a lot more technical. This was an overview, but it's a lot more technical on the physical and financial support of both the Bolsheviks and the Nazis, not with Rockefeller alone. There was actually a number of groups around him that also supported it. But the Red Cross played a big role, and Rockefeller was a big supporter of the Red Cross and a financier of the Red Cross. So looking at that, in other words, okay, how much of that was his influence and not? So next 2 weeks from now won't be so much about Rockefeller per se, but he'll be involved in some of those things, and definitely with eugenics, getting the information and doing the trade on technology and information and utilizing some of the products that were designed by the testing of the Nazis today. Yeah, it's definitely there. And so that was kind of surprising and kind of depressing, but there it is. But if you want to kind of look at that, you'll see probably more of our technique in 2 weeks from now, as far as being able to kind of find the facts, chase the rabbit hole, and document it. Like I said, this is just a familiarization on these last 2 weeks to kind of get you familiar with oligarchs and oligarch systems. So you had last week was Cromwell and Sullivan, which is basically working for the client. Now you have Rockefeller, who's a true believer, and he's the kind of the savior of the world, and he's moving forward in that respect. And governments to heck with them. If they're not with me, they're against me, kind of thing. So that's kind of what we see is there's two different types of oligarchies, right? One's kind of a crusader, the other's just kind of like, well, hey, it's a client, and purely for profit motives, so to speak. So you can see the nature of those. Next week we're going to go, or 2 weeks from now, we're going to go more into the details about, okay, this was the funding, this is where you can look for it, this is how it happened, and that sort of thing. And if you'd like to be able to learn how to think like a detective in historical, you can also use it for private investigators. Like I said, my day job is I'm a private investigator up in Pacific Northwest, and you can use these. It's the same techniques that we use in investigations, the same as law enforcement uses. We used in the military, but basically how to go about an investigation, looking at things and some tips and tricks about how to do research, where to look for information, how to evaluate those source documents that come in there, and to be able to weigh the evidence and then come to a conclusion in an evidence-based approach. That's something we like to do. The reason we did it was because we noticed a lot of the younger investigators coming in were way emotional, and they would just jump to conclusions, and you're like, well, hold on, where's your evidence? So I personally have an investment in making sure that, or trying to at least contribute to the younger generation that is right now endorphin fed and led, and they don't have rational thought processes. Some do, but a lot of them don't. They're very much just reactionary to what's around them. And I would like to see a lot more people out there with, critical thinking skills that are able to kind of follow those leads, push aside your emotions and get good data, get good evidence, weigh it, and then evaluate it. So I want to make sure the next generation has those skill sets. It doesn't disappear with AI and with, Twitter feeds and that sort of thing. I want to make sure that stays there. And so we set up this course. It's online, and basically it teaches people. Again, it's for young people, but definitely you could use it the old ones. I can't do cases now because that would be violating confidentiality, and privilege. But what I can do is we look at history through the lens of an investigator. Let's go in there, let's look at it, and then get us the source docs, weigh the evidence, and then some pretty fun things. And you'll find out a lot about the past. That's how we kind of found out about a lot of these oligarchs. Looking into these things, starting from a starting point, like why would a country do this? Oh, this is why. Again, if you're interested in that, you can see us on historyda.org. We're on Substack, Twitter, or Facebook. And hopefully that QR code kind of works. That should take you over to our Substack. And then we'll go over here and see if there's any questions. Maybe stop this. And if there's no questions or comments, we'll go ahead and move on. But if anybody has questions, type it in the comments section, and then we will get to those. And in addition to the Machiavellians Defenders of Freedom, recommend you go to the website. The archive.org is a really good website that you're able to go to. They have a number of source documents and entire books. They have filings, corporate filings, and everything. On Rockefellers, they have a lot. The other one that you can go to is, like I said, the Rockefeller Foundation themselves have a lot of those documentations. I wouldn't recommend if you're interested more in the march through the Catholic institution there with Notre Dame, their information and website has been altered. And so it leaves out a lot of the details, which are glaringly obvious. So it's a little bit biased. So I wouldn't recommend or lean too heavily on that. If you're looking for a couple of books specifically on oligarch structures, like I said, the Machiavellians Defender of Freedom, James Burnham. But another interesting one was Controligarchs by Seamus Brunner. And what he does is he looks at not just, he has a little bit on Rockefeller, but then he goes into more modern ones. We kind of stayed away from that because we wanted to keep this within a historical framework with Rockefeller himself. But some of the cases that he did say with the modern oligarch system. So, for example, the Bezos and Zuckerberg, and especially Gates, we had been tracking. We did have a lot of information on that one. So the Gates one did check out. It did pass the review that we looked at. And so we said, okay, he's on the Gates thing. Yep. Yeah, it passes a smell test. It holds up to the facts that we were able to independently look at. And on the Rockefeller, we looked at it, and he was 100% on the Rockefeller. So at least on those two parts, I could recommend the book if you are looking up Gates and Rockefeller. Beyond that, we have not independently verified it, but it'd be good for you to read it, get an idea for it, and then independently verify it on your own. So real quick, I'm going to go over to, we're going to do the YouTube thing here, because sometimes those comments don't fall through. So I'm going to have to look at the comments here. It'll just be one moment. And while I'm doing this, the one thing I forgot to mention was that some of the birth control with the IUDs that the Rockefeller team utilized, they were known to develop cervical cancers. And so when the researchers were saying, hey, there's a problem here with this intrauterine device that they were using for birth control, or they're trying to pioneer it, they said it causes cervical cancer. Sometimes it's a problem. It may cause, serious infection, secondary effects, and death. And the response that was given back was, well, that's what's our goal here, right? So it was implied that, okay, so you break a few eggs and that's okay. So that was kind of startling in that. So looking over here, nothing on YouTube. Um, Now we'll go over here to Rumble, and if there's nothing there, we'll go ahead and call it a day. If you do have any questions that come up after this, or if you're not watching this live, you're watching this on record, we can go ahead and answer those as best we can. The best one's probably on X, where they're most often, and so we'll be able to do kind of real-time response to that one. And I'm over on X right now, seeing if there's anything there. And it looks like not. So we'll go ahead and call it a day. So that has been Rockefeller. And again, just a basic overview of Rockefeller and, the impacts that it has on today and throughout history. So thank you very much. My name was Al Johnson for Historical Detective Agency. And hopefully you have a good and safe day. And any questions, please let us know, and never stop digging into history, following those leads where it goes.